Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to TechPoutine. Very happy we have a first new guest on the show, Gabriel Lesperance. Bienvenue, Gabriel.
Thank you, Nectar. I really appreciate. Excited to be here with you guys.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Obviously, today, it's a special episode because not only we have you, but we have a very special topic. We want to talk about Notman House, and it's been a lot of the news lately. But first, Gabriel, pour l'audience, maybe a brief intro, talk a little bit about your background, if that's okay.
Yeah. So I've been an entrepreneur for over 15 years now. My previous startup was called Wavo. It's been one of the fastest growing companies in Canada over the last 4 years. Essentially, what we used to do, they're still doing it actually, just no longer there. But essentially, what they do is data analytics and media buying for music. So yeah, they're really an innovative company. Super proud of them. Nowadays, what I do is I essentially work for on a project called Trampoline. And what we do is we augment the knowledge operations of enterprises by allowing them to search for all through all their unstructured data across all of the platforms that they use in the enterprise.
Intéressant, intéressant. I'm like, God damn, this sounds really interesting, man. I was like, I want to dive into it, but I guess it's kind of not the goal.
You're gonna have to
Next
invite me back.
episode.
That's it. Yeah, next episode, man. So maybe I'll just set the stage a little bit, just kind of setting kind of ground facts. And I think I'm really excited, obviously, to talk about Nama today because we have three people that are, I want to say, really key in helping grow the ecosystem, and obviously Notman being a huge linchpin and part of that. But recent news that Notman House has been put up for sale, or will be put up for sale, having issues obviously with paying its huge debt burden, particularly around the mortgage. And it's no surprise that obviously commercial real estate has had a little bit of a challenge with increased interest rates, and obviously a lot of its core revenue, which was advertising, kind of evaporated during the pandemic because it was a physical space. So I think that's kind of where we're at. It's just an unfortunate turn of events. But Navid's been so instrumental in growing the vibrant innovation ecosystem that was essentially non-existent before, and it was like nothing here. So maybe Gabriel Sundaram, I'll ask you to maybe, since I think you were the first person to wipe, like clean the floors of Notman House. Maybe give us a little bit of the brief oral history from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. And maybe just for context for the audience, that's actually where Ian and I met. Gab was at Notman House when he was first starting Wavo and going through the accelerator program that was being.
That's where we met too.
That's where we met.
Gabriel.
Exactly.
Yeah, all three of us. That's where we met, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's the connection with Gab and Wavo and Ian and all of us. But yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point, Nectar. Before Notman House, the startup community existed, but in many ways we were floating. We didn't really have a home base that we can get together and work together as a community. We had a lot of monthly events that were happening. And in many ways, we would get together, for startup drinks or for a new tech demo, get super excited about what we were working on, and kind of go back to our own homes, our own basements, our own offices, and work and kind of lose that momentum a little bit, and then come back together a month later and then get re-energized again. And so the spirit of Notman was like, hey, let's create a dedicated space where people from the community can get together and work together under the same roof so that you can really have that energy going 24/7 and all throughout the month. And it became home base for a lot of us. And, throughout the years, there's so many stories of how people have met because of Notman House and have gone on to do really amazing things.
It was really ground zero, at least from my perspective. I mean, back then, to me, I think it was 2011. That was the first Founder Fuel cohort. I guess my career as an entrepreneur was just getting started. I had some other things before, but for me, like Notman was how I discovered like what was a startup in itself. And I think one of the funniest thing to me about that is that in itself, I always saw back then Notman House as its own startup because there was nothing back then. There was no AC unit. There was like there were barely any offices. Like we were all camping out of like these rooms that were there, and like the meetups themselves were kind of just figuring things by themselves. It was an era in itself.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
I remember, I mean, when we were starting to build what became Founder Fuel, this is when you and I met, Gabriel,
Yeah.
and we were thinking about like where do we host it, what's the program, and we quickly decided it would be at Notman House, and we were doing some recruiting as well. And I remember Connor, who was Gabriel's co-founder in Wavo, and I remember quite liking the two guys and wanting to see them in the program. And you know, Connor was like, "How do I get in? What do I need to do?" And I said, you know, just think about who's going to be making the selections of who's going to join this program, and they're all in Notman House. I'm like, spend all your time here. Like, make sure you're bumping into John and Mark and JS and Alan and myself. And like, and I remember Connor like coming in, like freezing his ass off, working at Notman House, trying to get into the program. And like, you know, essentially he did get in the program.
yeah.
Not just because he was hanging out at Notman House, but of course I was
Well,
part of it.
to tell you the truth, like I'm still telling the story of how we got into Founder Fuel, because back then we were 220 something, barely out of university, and literally like that was our plan. We took this advice you gave us, and basically while I would be building the software, we would have Connor camp out of Notman House. And honestly, like the no AC kind of thing, he still remember very much. He was like writing back to us like, "Oh my god, guys, I really hope we get into this accelerator because I'm spending all of my time." He tried to get as much space time as we could with
Yeah.
everybody over there. Then we would even go to all the meetups, right? Kind of trying to fake it till we made it, because I guess we were young back then and didn't know more than that, and try to ask intelligent questions at the meetups, such as Ian would see like, oh, these guys are bright or they got some grit. But honestly, like the crazy part about it, I think, is that it's kind of like through this fake it till we made it that in itself, like Notman like taught us to be
Yeah.
kind of entrepreneurs somewhat.
Yeah, I think
Maybe good to level set what Notman House was at the time, because it's not what it is today, right?
No,
Like taking
no.
back people. Remember Gabriel's sunroom? Like it was just the front of the house. Do you want to set context on like what it was?
Yeah,
I
at
would
that
also
point.
add, yeah, I would also add, Gabriel, maybe also context for like how was it started, who started it, like a little bit basic facts too.
Yeah, sure. So, back in the day, the house was really just the front house. At that point, the building that's in back, the 4-story building in the back, wasn't even usable. It had been abandoned for, I think, 20 years or so, or more probably, and really was in a state of disarray. And so it took a lot of money to rebuild it. And so I can tell the story a little bit through my own story, Nectar. So I actually happened to be the first person to rent an office space at Notman House. It was funny. There was a bunch of instigators within the community that were kind of rallying around creating this space for the community. And I saw the news actually on Twitter back in the day when we used to call it Twitter. Sylvain Carl posted something that they were painting the walls at Notman House and it's going to be opening up for people to get space. I had actually met John Stokes through some meetups that I was going to. There used to be startup breakfast back in the day. I met John Stokes through that. So I reached out and said, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. I used to work in the startup in the US. I'm working from Montreal from my apartment. I'd love an office space. And I happened to be the first tenant to move in. Through that, I ended up getting very involved in Notman House. And so Notman House is and was kickstarted by a not-for-profit association called the Osmo Foundation, which is kind of short for the OS of Montreal startup community, but also is a connection to the word osmosis, which is a very important key part of what happens at Notman House. And so the not-for-profit was the one that really raised the funds to be able to purchase Notman House, renovate Notman House, and run the programs that run through Notman House. And so, because I happened to be early, I just got involved as a volunteer in terms of, building the financial plans, pitching the different governments to raise money, raising the money, helping to drive the renovations. It wasn't like something that was planned. It just kind of fell into place because it was a community initiative and everybody was coming together to try to make it happen. It's kind of interesting, like part of the story of Notman for me, as I mentioned, when I moved in, I was part of a startup from the US. I recruited my friend, Greg Whiteside, who I met through different community events as well, to come take an office at Notman with me. He was working on a startup. I was working on a startup. We were sitting in one of the small offices on the second floor of Notman House, and we were both working on our gigs, but I ended up moving diagonally across the hall to work at Real Ventures, and Greg moved directly across the hall to join Password Box, which later became TrueKey. And so, like, that was the magic of Notman House. Like, because we were in that space, it dramatically increased the odds of us connecting with other entrepreneurs and other opportunities. Because, like Ian was saying, and Gab was saying, by being together, you increase the number of connections, you build tighter relationships.
And we can push that story even further, right?
Yeah.
Like, Seb Malherbe, who was one of the first hires of Password Box, who was at Notman House, later became my co-founder in Breathe Life. And JN, who was an early hire as well, was my co-founder in Breathe Life. And that's part of what's magical about a spot like that, right? You hang out with like-minded individuals who have the same types of ambitions, and magical things happen, right? And
Yeah.
there's so many other stories of that nature that can be tied
Yeah.
to
And
Notman House. And Greg is now CEO of Human First, which he started afterwards, and his co-founders also he met at Password Box. Like, it's just, that's part of what a space like this provides, right?
yeah. And it's a ripple effect, right? It just kind of keeps moving forward in time in terms of the impact that it's have. The other story that I tell about Notman that really, to me, highlights the importance and the power of having a physical space and an open and accessible space is how I met Sam from Real Ventures, Sam Hafar. And so we used to have Real Ventures office on the second floor of Notman House in the front building. And the office that Real's using today used to be the cafe. And so it was like a mini MVP of the full Notman House. And Sam, being from San Francisco, had recently moved to Montreal, and he Googled startups, Montreal, spaces, co-working, and he found Notman House. And he just wandered in and was hanging out in the cafe. And a few people saw him, we chit chat in the cafe downstairs. But one day he kind of wandered up to the second floor and he poked his head into the office, the Real Ventures office. And he was like, "Hey, is there a VC fund here?" I happened to be the only one in the office at that time. And so I was like, "Yeah, this is Real Ventures. I'm going for lunch. You want to come join me for lunch?" And so we went out for lunch, and he told me his story is like, just moved here from San Francisco. He was VP marketing at a like massively, rapidly growing startup called Chegg that went public. He had co-founded two companies before that. And instantly I was like, hey, we need to find a way that you can get involved in the community and help mentor some of the earlier companies. But the reality is, if he had tried to email us, we would have probably never seen it, right? Because we were getting so many emails from so many random people that wanted to get involved. But just having a physical space where he can come in, get to know people, establish that relationship really created a ripple effect.
Gabriel, first of all, I love that story, Gab. I'd like to poke Gabriel that wrote a really good op-ed in Le Devoir, right? Like, so we spoke about the value that it created in the city, and I want to focus in specifically on the value for entrepreneurs, right? So you wrote Pourquoi il faut sauver la maison Notman. So maybe give us a little bit of why you write that article, and then the benefit, obviously, you've seen yourself as being, like a serial entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, it has a lot of layers to it, but one of the first thing that's important to have a physical space for companies, and especially for new companies, is that it is sort of a symbol of what is possible and what you can be, right? If you go to the first time I went to Notman, right, like I said, it was in itself an MVP, right? And I saw that you could actually make it something bigger, right? Back then, like Ian and Gabe said, there was literally nothing. The cafe was what is now an office. The coffee back then was community made coffee. We had no fancy barista that would made it for us. And like every day in Notman where Notman got a little better was a win for the community. I still remember at the beginning of Thunderfield where Ian just came in, and that's Thunderfield just started, and he just came in like raging, like he just won like a championship, right? And it's like, we're like, oh, what's going on? It's like, you know what? I just sang a Red Bull. We have a Red Bull fridge now in the office. Because I told them, you're like fuel for founders, right? Because that they use like caffeine and they code on that and everything. And
Yeah.
so that's what Notman was about, right? And it's about like Password Box. Obviously, Password Box had an office, but they had like a desk first, and at some point they took over the full office. And like it's not only like the companies that got through it got better. Not everyone made it through. Obviously, it's the startup world. Being a founder is rough, but you could see people going through Notman, organizing hackathons. You could see them leaving Notman, but oftentimes for greener pastures because they outgrew Notman. And I think that's the first thing that's very important about Notman as a symbol, right? It's about like the possibility of a community to get together and make it happen, right? Back then, yeah, like it was connected to kind of like wanting to to the accelerator in itself, but it was the community. The hackathons happened at Notman House, right? The first Node.js is big. Everybody talks about it right now, but the first time you heard about it back then was at Notman House. So that's something that was also very important. This idea that where people would get acquainted with entrepreneurship and startups. One of the key hires we did at Wavo, now Wavo's VP of Engineering, Arlen Stalwick. Huge shout out to this man. We found him at a hackathon we organized there, and like back then there was no better way to connect, and it's still the case, right? Like if you go to the Notman Cafe, you're going to see people that are working in their startups. You're going to see people that have already had the startup, right? And I think that's also a point of value that really that Notman really brings forward. But it's also Notman outgrowing itself too. I think the whole story of Notman is incredible. Like I say, for me, it is a startup in itself that managed to grow from that small house at the front and to the back and to have a cafe, and it's about what is possible.
Yeah, and I think what's important, and maybe this is something that we can do as TechPoutine or other people can do as well. But like, it's to tell the success stories, right? Like, it's easy to forget them. And I just thought of a great example. Like, Notman House was basically born in 2011 ish, right? My my oldest son is 14. And now that he's 14, we live in Montreal and he's exploring Montreal. And he comes back and so he's taking public transportation and all that. And he comes back one day. He's like, Dad, I discovered this amazing app. I'm like, what is it? And he says, it's called Transit. I'm like, oh, I know Transit very well. He's like, oh, you do? I'm like, he says, you use it? I'm like, yeah, I use it. But more importantly, like, you know, we were the first investors in Transit app. I know Sam, the founder, very, very well. And my son's like, yeah, whatever, Dad, blah, blah, blah.
Whatever, Dad. You think you're so
Right,
cool.
whatever, Dad. And Transit started before Notman House, yes, but they went through Founder Fuel at Notman House, and that night I texted Sam, who I'm still in contact with, and I tell him the story about how my son is using his app and he loves it.
Mhm.
And he's like, "Oh, that's so great! Say hi to your son." And I showed my son. My son was like, "Whoa, that's crazy!" Because how does my father know the founder of Transit App? But my point is this, right? Transit App, which again started before Notman House, but went through Founder Fuel. We like to think it was part of the thing that helped them grow. And now it's like it's a name brand. You fly out of Dorval Airport. Transit App is all over the airport now. It's like it's the most one of the most used transit apps, transportation apps in the App Store, right? It's huge. Like, and that all went through, at one point in time through Notman House, right? And there's all kinds of examples like that, right? Like,
Yeah. There's
Yeah,
a
uh,
few
and there
things.
was there was
Go
a
ahead,
compounding
Gabriel.
effect too, right? Like I really remember because first found the fuel cohort. I mean, people were good, right, and great, but I do remember the fact of just being there at at Notman and being kind of like, yeah, like we're doing this, right, and it is possible to do it, right. You have different companies, like One Education now. I think that was called Ulala. Was
Mhm.
it One Education? I'm not exactly sure anymore.
Ready
Sorry,
yeah,
Daniel.
education.
yeah,
Ready Education, right?
Yeah.
Like huge success, right? Player Rise, what a good success as well. But what I remember is true. The thing about Notman and having like this central place is that it resonates, right, throughout the whole
Mhm.
community, right? And Transit App is a super good example. Like uh, the thing about having this symbol that again resonates is that each cohort you get is just better than the next one, and I really say that. I think what's important about a thing like Notman House is how it resonates through the whole ecosystem and through Founder Fuel, and Transit App is a really good example of that, how it became better with each future cohort of it. So, you really have this compounding effect, right? So you have Ready Education, that was a huge success. There was Sunder, Heyday as well, right? Like it compounds. And those are the things that I think we need to be mindful as a society when we think about a place like Notman, because those are intangible, right? And you really got to stick to those.
Yeah,
yeah.
I would say it's
And
not
there are
that
other examples
intangible
too,
though.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
what are some of the other examples? Missouri is a founding food company that was in Notman House as well. But
Yeah,
these
Pastor
are,
Box had their first office at Notman House. There's also some tech companies that have passed through Notman House as well, right? Like Shopify had their first Montreal office at Notman House. I rented the office to them. Uber had,
Uber did too.
yeah, Uber had
Uber,
their first office at Notman House. And so I think that's part of the story as well, right? It's entrepreneurs getting together, but it's also the opportunity to cross paths and connect with these other folks who are working in more mature startups.
yeah. Yeah, and Gabriel, you mentioned how it's intangible, and yes, there's a part of it that's very intangible. But then, like we just mentioned, I don't know how many companies like you can measure literally economic value, number of jobs created in a city, and the role it's played. So, like the very tangible value of how do you help an entrepreneur where success is far from assured, right? So this cohort of like crazy people that are like, hey, we want to start this thing, and we want to start a company, and like you're literally alone in your basement, with a group of like-minded individuals, but
Mhm.
that's it, right? So
Yeah.
the notion of the startup is usually to help challenge the status quo. So I think having this physical space is provides solace and camaraderie and of course
Yeah.
knowledge. on top of all these other things. So yeah, I think it's very tangible in terms of how you can measure it. And
Mhm.
then there's, I think the reason we're all talking is because there's so much value created. It's hard to even describe it, right? So the
Yeah.
intangible aspect of like meeting people, getting people, like finding a co-founder or a very skilled employee. There's so many of these stories, which is why, like I think it's obviously very apropos to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
I
hard
have a
to.
question
100%.
for you. Maybe I can ask you a question, Nectar. You're always asking the questions, but how do you think, we're talking about the importance of a space, right? Which, Notman House, that's what it is, and tremendous value generated from it. How does that change, or does it not change at all in the world where, a lot of companies don't have an office? I noticed, Gabriel, it seems like you're in an office today, but like a lot of people are working from home. What's the role of a Notman House in that world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that for me, it's the question of like positive sum. That's how I see it, right? So I think the argument of, oh, well, Nodman is not needed because now there's so many other accelerators and incubators in the city. I don't think like it's not negative. That was, of course, we want more because, like we said, it's like technology as a segment is growing. So in the community aspect, having more Nodmans, like having, the spaces like at RTS, spaces at McGill, the new Axie. These are all very good things. These are all
Mhm.
very accretive to the ecosystem. But I think, Gabriel, you mentioned as to why it should be protected is the nature of compounding, right? It's like the startup is growing. It's like it's past its, like the early uncertain years, and it's creating a lot of value. So I feel like it'd be a shame we wouldn't be extracting enough value, to use maybe too much of an investment term, if we stop today. And then to go back to your question, Ian, about physical versus remote. Um, Listen, I'm a bit more old school. I find that yes, there's certain cultures that could be fully remote, but at the foundation, like the initial idea, the two, three, four people that are starting something, FaceTime is extremely important for that human interaction to gel with your co-founders. Like, what the fuck are we building, guys? Like, what do we want to do? And guys and girls, of course, like, what do we want to do? Right? Where do we want to take it? Like all these important questions that only happen at the foundation of a startup. So I think yes, it's still important to have physical spaces, and yes, like of course there's going to be a myriad of digital tools now, but I still think it has its role to play. As we're seeing now, is like a lot of startups are moving back into offices, right, where they're
Yeah.
working together late nights, and it's hard to replicate in a purely online world.
Mhm. Yeah, I think Notman today is even more relevant than ever, right? I think people need these spaces to come together. They need the flexibility that a space like Notman creates. They need to be around other people as well. I completely agree. We talk about this a lot at Mission. We definitely are fans of being able to run companies in a remote fashion. Mission is remote first, and we, as everyone knows from the model, that is part of the reason why Mission exists, is because of this ability to work with remote talent. But at the same time, we definitely recognize that there's value being in the same space and in the same city. Like my two other co-founders are here in Montreal. The conversations that we can have when we're together are completely different than if we're trying to do it on Zoom. And I think a lot of people, I was just talking to CTO of a venture studio called Fractal out of New York City. They've invested in 145 startups. And he was talking about remote work and the ability to build product in a remote fashion. And I think we all agreed the reality is, in a discovery phase, being in person is extremely important. When you think
Mm.
about product development and software engineering, you can do amazing work when you're in the rhythm and you're optimizing software. But when you're in that very, very, very early stage of discovery, it doesn't work over Zoom the same way. I mean, we all did it, right? During the pandemic, everybody pushed new software, new features, etc. But I think we can all agree as well that there's something definitely magical that happens when you get in the same space, especially when you're brainstorming.
Yeah, it's even more important nowadays. I totally agree with you because, I mean, yeah, of course, deep work is important, but when you don't have an office in itself, a place where you can meet other people and network is even more important. So yeah, I think, yeah, Notman has even more of an impact than before. And I like what you're saying, Nectar. Like that's true that the impact is like super tangible. I just think that it's too bad that it doesn't get to be like, hey, we have a counter at Notman of how many jobs we created through
Yeah.
the people that
Yeah.
passed through here. There would be a lot, and like these are not always companies that exit big, right? And the thing is that companies that don't exit big are also often, companies that do create a lot of very long-standing jobs.
Yeah.
VC model notwithstanding, it created. I remember Pelcro, right? Pelcro is from Montreal, went through Founder Fuel. My good friend Michael Gatta, CEO of it, amazing company, right? And like they're running pretty well, and they went through Notman, and I think definitely tangible there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Well, look at
think,
Wavo, right? One of the fastest growing companies in Canada a few years running. I mean, that's real tangible benefit to
yeah.
everyone.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's possible for someone to go back and try to map and calculate the number of jobs created, investment pulled in to Montreal, Quebec, Canada, because of the companies created at Notman House. But I also think that it's difficult without taking a lot of time and asking people, like in a qualitative way, to understand the background stories, right? Of like, you were just saying, Gab, you met your VP Eng at Wavo at a hackathon through Notman House. You it's hard to find all those stories, and we hear them all the time. And so while the quantitative numbers are easy to measure, I think it's only half of the story. I think you have to presume behind those numbers, there's probably 2, 3x, 4x more impact that's
Yeah, for
happening.
sure.
Yeah. So that we're talking about creating jobs because that's an easy one. But another thing that we need to be very mindful when we think about places like Notman and the startup ecosystem is that most of these companies, and like it's not like I have numbers, but I do know from a anecdotal evidence that most of these companies are actually like exporting companies, right? Like they bring money in Canada, in Montreal. That's money that's spent here that comes from elsewhere, and that's
Mhm.
also huge, right? That's also why like tech sector is working well.
Yeah.
So I guess another question maybe to dive into it. So like, what is the distinction in my view with, let's say, Real Ventures that was instrumental at the beginning versus today? So I like to better understand the nonprofit foundation versus Real that was obviously there at the beginning. So,
Yeah, so Real Ventures was definitely very instrumental in terms of Notman being created and having a chance to be created, because Real was the first tenant of Notman House. And so they came in, they signed a lease. Instead of taking a Class A office space downtown Montreal, they chose to take a Class C office space in the Plateau and work out of a very small office with no air conditioning, very poor heating, so that we could have created more space for other entrepreneurs to be able to work together. So Real's been an important part of this story. I think the challenge has been that because they were so instrumental at the beginning, I think it became very difficult for people to separate Notman House from Real Ventures. And that really wasn't the intention, right? The intention was for it to never be a Real Ventures like project or the House of Real Ventures. That's why another nonprofit was created. But because I think John Stokes and Alan McIntosh were always very implicated and very committed and really spent a lot of time to try to make the house possible, it was hard for the community to really separate the two. I think that's slowly has changed over time, but still today, when I talk to some people, they have a hard time separating Notman House from Real Ventures. And I talked to John Stokes last week. He from his perspective, he would rather that the world never knew Real was involved in Notman House, but that Notman House became a thing. He cared about the impact that Notman House could have, not that it was associated to Real Ventures or even to himself. He really saw the opportunity and the impact that it can have. And so it's kind of a shame in a way that it never really, got disassociated from real ventures. I think there's many reasons for that, but definitely it's a community project. There's representation from multiple people who have been involved in the past and today. And I think that's really part of the future of Notman House as well, hopefully.
Hey, Gabriel, what drove you to write that article? Like, what pushed you that, that you're like, hey, I'm going to contact Le Devoir and like ask them for an op-ed?
Um, I think to me it's about serendipity to some extent. I think Notman gave me a lot, and I really thought that part of the story, insofar as I only had a facet of it had to be told. Yeah, really serendipity, I would say.
Moi, en tout cas, je lève mon chapeau. Ça m'a pris plusieurs lectures avant de me rendre compte que c'était toi qui l'avais écrit. C'était comme, oh my God, I know this guy.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it at first. So I think that's, it's a hell of a gesture, and it says a lot about how much you care about the community. And, I
Yeah.
think all of us should thank you for doing that, right? Out of the goodness of your heart. Que je lève mon chapeau. Merci.
Yeah, for sure. I think even despite how intertwined Nectar, Ian, and I have been with Notman House, we found out through the article that you wrote. We heard some chatter about something may be happening, but the article is really what created the awareness for me, and so that's part of the power of spreading the word, right?
Yeah, well, honestly, like I yeah, I don't know. Again, it's funny. Like for me, it's about, again, I'll say it again, serendipity. I think like I don't know, like I think Notman's. We deserve to believe in Notman as much as we all believe in Notman at first, and Notman believed in me. Like to me, like it's serendipity for the future, but it was serendipity from me to Notman to you guys. Like I I don't know. Like it's yeah. I think this is a special place. And I mean, I'm really, I'm kind of like touched that it was like an important impact for you guys. To be honest,
Yeah.
I was not really thinking about it when that way when I was writing it. It's just like, hey, like there was something to be said, right? Like I think, and we couldn't just. No matter what happens, Notman's story is important, and the symbol is important. But I'd rather it continue to deliver on this on what it's doing than just be a symbol in our imagination and in stories we told. There are still many stories to be written from Notman, I think.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the the fact that you wrote that article, it says a lot about what I think is something that I believe in a lot around the tech community. I feel like it's very much a you scratch my back, I scratch yours type of mindset. Um, all boats rise type of thing. And, for this article to come out from someone that, went through that process of seeing the early days of Notman House and wanting to give back and to like not let it disappear. Like to me, it's a great example of how like the tech community works hand in hand together because, I think to me, building tech for good is really for good, not for just because we can, is really a big part of how I think. I've shared that many times on the podcast already,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a great example, right? And
Yeah.
I love how you said that there are more stories to be told,
Yeah.
and yeah, so this is a real testimony to how the tech community in my mind works and operates.
100%. And it's so funny that you mentioned that. You just brought a memory to me, like it's something that I honestly I'd forgotten. But so before being an entrepreneur in tech, then in tech and in music through Wavo, I was a computer science student, but also back then I was a DJ back then in it, and so I was very involved in the Montreal music scene. And one of the things that when people that I answered when people ask me, "Hey, like, what are you doing now? Why did you leave music, right? And why did you especially want to go in tech?" Was exactly what you described, Ian. It was this. I was fascinated, and somehow I guess I take it for granted, or it's kind of system one and two. You forget things, but this idea of giving back to the community, this idea of the people in tech working together, and that's the way it works, right? In the tech community, right? Like my contacts are your contacts, right? Someone raising around is good for you, right? Someone like having difficulty, like on challenges, hiring, it's something that we all come together, right? And yeah, and it is so core to what it is. And Notman was a lot of that too. And you learned that at Mon, and it
Yeah.
was so clear back then, like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
how unique that is.
I'm
I
definitely
have
happy.
an idea.
Yeah.
I have an idea. I feel like we should hold hands and sing Kumbaya and wrap this thing together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
With,
think it's a
with,
great way to wrap off, Gabriel. I think you
yeah.
mentioned it very well, right? So this notion of giving back to the community. And I think some of us are also thinking about how to give back to Notman. So I'd say if people are interested, reach out to Gabriel S on the call. There's a bunch of entrepreneurs just looking to, hey, what can we do? Just exploring, just voicing our support, like on this podcast,
Mhm.
or trying to share your article. I think anything goes a long way today, because we've all benefited, right? So yeah, thanks
Yeah.
for coming on the show, Gabriel. And if you're open to it, man, we'd love to have you back on.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Anytime, guys.
I definitely appreciate you coming on, Gab. But like we talked about a couple of days, your story is special because I love that 10 years ago, 11 years ago, you really walked into Notman House, as a recent student or maybe even a student at the time. I
I
don't know,
was a student.
as a student at the time. And you walked out an entrepreneur, a super successful entrepreneur. And that was the magic of Notman House. I don't know. Not a lot of people know. I had the pleasure of actually meeting one of the great grandchildren of William Notman when I was working at Notman in the early days, and told them the story of what we were trying to build at Notman House. And it was kind of nice. They really resonated with the project. Like a lot of people may not know, Notman was an entrepreneur in so many ways, and was a technologist of his time. He was basically doing like graphic design, the type of graphic design you would do with like different tools today, with like the technology he had at the moment. And so he was a
With
technologist.
film.
Yeah, with
With
film.
film.
Yeah, he was doing all sorts of crazy technical and artistic things, and was a tech entrepreneur. And so I'm not a believer in spirits or ghosts or whatever, but something magical definitely happens at Notman House, and so it's great. It's great to hear the story.
Symbols are important at the end of the day. Like
Mhm.
they don't need to be ghosts or stories, or like when we get around something and we believe in it, like it becomes something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Guys, thanks again. Gabriel, merci beaucoup.